Hey everyone, and welcome to How to Make Your Own Miniatures Game. This is episode 4. I am Rick Graham, owner of White Light Media and creator of the Revelation Skirmish and Field of Legends miniatures games. You can check out my company's website and get information on our other projects by going to whitelightmedia.org. Alright, so today's going to be a little bit different. Normally when I'm recording these episodes, it's late at night after the kids have gone to bed, so hopefully the traffic outside of my apartment isn't too loud for you guys. I'm hoping, but there's only so much we can do about that. So today we are going to be continuing the conversation of designing the initial fundamentals of your game. And we're also going to begin to discuss beginning components and mechanics. This won't be super in-depth on any one type of mechanic like movement or attack or defense, depending on even what type of game you're designing. Now, I will preface this. If this is the first episode you've listened to from me, I am coming from the perspective of designing a war game. If you're designing any other type of miniature game, you'll be able to still take away components of this to help you, but just know that that's the filter that all of my comments and all of my, I'd say, guidance kind of comes from, okay? So by now, you should know what the scope and scale of your game is. You should already have begun to move forward on your general idea of the lore and the setting for your universe. If you haven't, not a big deal, but I have posted some other episodes to help with those very topics, so they'll get a little bit more into that. We're just kind of focusing more on the actual game side of the game right now. Now, you might be wondering, Rick, how many rules do I need to design before I'm able to do my alpha and beta test? Which, speaking of which, what is the difference between the two? Because sometimes those terms get thrown around and maybe not everyone is caught up on what they are. The alpha test is generally an internal test for a business or for a group, while a beta test is usually used much closer to the end of development and uses your real users or your real gamers or a sampling of what your player base may be. However, since you're likely a 1 or 2 person operation, most of your testing will involve other gamers or friends and family or other people that are not involved in the internal components of the game making. So we'll just call it beta testing for simplicity's sake. I'm not going to get deep into the weeds of what is the proper name, but plus most gamers will understand if you say you're in beta testing anyhow. So I wouldn't super worry about it. Technically, some of the stuff I'm going to be describing is alpha testing, but it doesn't really matter. It's kind of just vernacular for the sake of whatever. You don't need to get lost into that. Now we're going to talk about what you need to start rolling some dice, to start doing some initial testing, because in my opinion, you can get caught up in building rules and all this intricate work, and then when it comes time to start actually playing the game, actually testing components of your game, you'll find that it sucks, or that it's way different than what you thought, or the balance is just a nightmare. Things are just way crazy strong or way crazy weak. And my advice is we are going to discuss a couple of basic things that you're going to be able to start working on, at least some things you can start thinking about, and then that will give you a place to start doing some testing. Now, some people may disagree. They may say, Rick, I don't do testing, or I don't think I should do testing until 50% of my game is designed, 80% of my game is designed. I disagree. I think you should start way sooner. I wouldn't say necessarily you do it day one, but once you get to a comfortable place of how core mechanics work, I think you should start testing it. Even if you're just playing against yourself, you're only testing how certain aspects of your game function, and you won't know if they function until you start to do it. Okay. If you're building a war game, you'll obviously need some sort of movement mechanic. Attacking and how you defend. Those are going to be vital to how the game operates. And you're likely going to need some other component for your engine that needs to be addressed very early, such as designing a few weapons so that you can even perform attacks. So if your game is a lot more ranged based, I would recommend you focus on ranged weapons first. If you're going to have like a fantasy type war game where a lot of melee matters, big heroic sword fights and stuff like that, I would focus on the melee combat first. In my opinion, you want to try to focus on the things that are the real driving force for your game. If your game is going to be a lot of shooting and a lot of melee, pick one. I would say I'd probably go with shooting first because the ranged attacks will very likely happen before melee attacks do. So even if you're playing, 3x3 or 6x3, whatever type of space you're playing for your game, when players are across from each other, there's probably going to be a round or two of your game that has models exposed to being just shot and they can't really retaliate because they're melee focused. So I would primarily prioritize ranged attacks if ranged attacks are going to be a big deal in your game. If you're building some other type of game, you'll need to figure out and isolate what is the absolute minimum you need to test. So if it's a sports type game or some sort of resource management game or anything else, you need to figure out what is the bare bones minimum to start doing some testing. All right, so now you might be wondering, well, what should I expect from my first test, right? So like once you get a couple of things put together, what should I kind of look for? I would say more than likely you should probably be expecting pretty much complete failure. And I say that with like a grain of salt because you'll probably not enjoy most of how the game plays. But right now that doesn't matter. This testing is some of your very first sessions and the engine is nowhere near complete. You need to make lots of notes, lots and lots of notes. Okay. Mental notes are great, but writing down some sort of, even if it's a really short note to jog your memory of like some, combat mechanic that you used, I'm just telling you, you're going to forget. A lot of us are very busy, right? We are doing something else full time. So the game making is either a hobby or it's something we want to get into professionally, but we're not there yet. So you're going to have things distract you, right? And you're going to end up forgetting things. Try to keep in mind as you're writing your notes, what you liked, what you disliked, and what you couldn't stand. Because sometimes something you don't like can have some tweaks and become something you do like. But something you can't stand whatsoever, you probably need to re-examine it and it may need to come out. Okay? And maybe your first engine, the first attempts that you start doing, doesn't even function at all. What do you do then when it doesn't even work? Well, it means you probably missed out on some very basic component and the game can't even be played without it. So that doesn't mean what you've designed is hot garbage. Maybe there's a component you're forgetting or that wasn't there that will make a huge difference. My first sessions when I was designing Revelation Skirmish were riddled with problems. And I mean that like seriously. I tried to implement in my very first testing sessions critical hits. And initially what a critical hit would do is whenever you rolled a 10, because I used a D10 system for attacking, if you rolled a natural 10, that natural 10 would be not only a hit, it would do an additional point of damage. Well, that doesn't sound so bad, except that Revelation Skirmish is meant to be a very fast-paced game. So some units have much smaller health pools to kind of make the game move faster. Well, when you have an infantry squad that's throwing 6 dice and you roll multiple 10s, now that's extra damage that those infantry are doing even to war mechs. And so my war mechs in Revelations are 2 to 3 story tall behemoth, just monstrous machines that are pretty agile, but can still be destroyed by infantry because the nations have developed anti-mech weaponry so that infantry still have a potential role in combat. The mechs are not king, they're just another piece in the arsenal of the nation, right? Just like vehicles and aircraft. So the infantry ended up being super, super, super lethal because I could just kind of fish for crits and just keep rolling until I could get some 10s. And then I'm doing this automatic extra damage to any unit that I'm shooting at. When mechs would fire and they had a much lower rate of fire, and so even if they rolled this really strong weapon, they'd only roll 1 dice, maybe 2 dice. Well, so when you got your infantry rolling all these extra dice, I would discover that rate of fire with critical hits with an extra point of damage was devastating. And I didn't even catch it right away because at first I enjoyed it. I was like, man, these infantry are crazy good. That's awesome. I love this, that the infantry feel lethal to tanks and mechs. But then as we continued on in the months of development, it became really clear that infantry weren't fully broken, but they were way better than what they brought to the table. Meaning, in my point structure system, which I wouldn't even worry about point structure right now, but in my point structure system, I deal in fives. So a regular squad of infantry is 5 points. I wanted most of my point system to be in fives, in tens, fives, so that players could memorize it a little bit easier. Because I know sometimes people really like to be able to build lists when they're at work, or they're doing some other, like they're washing dishes and they're like, okay, what kind of cool new list can I make? And when everything is like 13 points, 17, 28, it gets hard to remember the values because they're all these fractured numbers. And I was thinking, well, fives and tens, that's easier to memorize. Well, a 5-point infantry unit that would roll, depending on the nation, 5 or 6 dice versus a mech that was, let's say, 40 points, rolling 1 dice for its big cannon. Well, my infantry were just outperforming what they were doing at 5 points. They were way more valuable at 5 points than maybe a mech was at 40. And because of that critical hit system. So it took me a while to finally realize, and I started experimenting with an alternative method, which I can get into later if people are interested, or they could read the rules and play the game. Yeah, that's fun too. But all that to say, that was an initial component that I really thought was going to be a lot of fun. And then as testing continued, I started realizing how broken it was, or at least how overpowered it was. It wasn't fully broken, but it needed to be more regulated. One way I did that was I altered the way the critical hit system worked. And then the other is in Revelation Skirmish, we use keywords, very similar to like Star Wars Legion and a lot of other games that also have their own keyword system. And that allowed me to make infantry weapons not have, for example, they cannot critical hit armor and mech units unless it's specific in their keywords for that weapon. So that way it sort of controlled that. And it made a 5-point unit feel more like a 5-point unit rather than feeling like a 20-point unit, but I only paid 5 for it. So in your balancing system later, those point systems will matter. Those other components will matter. But the only way you're going to know that is by testing. Okay. I would say probably when I first started with Revelation Skirmish, I probably had, just to quantify it, I probably had like 4 or 5% of the rules down from what I have today. A couple months ago, we did a pretty major update. Didn't really change any rules, but we added some more advanced rules. So going off of from where we are right now as I record this, yeah, I'd probably say it was like a 4 or 5% when we first started doing testing. And that's not even counting, we did make changes. So we didn't have rules at first for jumping modifiers. We didn't have rules at first for rear arc. We didn't have rules for, what else? Melee attacks. We didn't have all kinds of keywords that just did not exist. All sorts of weapons and units that just didn't exist at the time. So, I mean, 4% might actually even be a pat on the back for me. It may have even been like 2% or 1% of when you look at everything that's going on now. Now, as I'm designing Field of Legends, I have a different perspective, in part because we're using some of the core mechanics from Revelation Skirmish. So our playtesting is already further ahead technically because we have a decent skeletal structure to kind of build from. But also I've just learned the better ways to do playtesting. So we're kind of implementing that. So Field of Legends is going way smoother as it's being designed versus the experience I went through with Revelation Skirmish. But enough about my stuff at the moment. How do you design basic stats? So this is going to be a bit subjective as it depends on how complex your stat system will be. Some people, like if you're going for a combat system that's similar to something like BattleTech, your weapons, so like your attacks are pretty simple, right? You're only rolling something like 2d6, but the way that all the other components tie in, like a heat management system and then all these modifiers for terrain and movement, all these things, it ends up adding a lot of components on top of it. If you're going for something that's similar to like Warhammer 40K, you're going to have a totally different outlook on the way your combat system works, for example. So what I would say is, try to keep in mind the type of game you want to have. Don't worry about terrain modifiers. Don't worry about movement modifiers right now. Get to the bare bones minimum. Let's just assume you've got one unit standing 10 inches away from another unit just standing out in the open, and you're just going to roll attacks it against each other. using whatever sort of turn system you have designed. And just do it that way. Just do it super, super, super basic. Don't try to mix in, I want to design all these heroes and all these big tanks. And then there's going to be like a way you can bombard the battlefield and do all this crazy stuff. Like, that's too much at first. You have to get the fundamentals locked in, test it again, and test it some more to make sure you like that. And then you're going to build on that. All right. And you kind of need to figure out, once you know, okay, what are the basic components I need? So let's say, for example, you need something where we're not even going to worry about movement right now. We're going to focus on 2 models standing out in the open, or 2 units, 2 squads, whatever the basic grunt unit will be of your game. We're going to put 2 basic guys out there, and they're just going to take turns taking shots at each other, like in the Revolutionary War in the U.S., right? You just got 2 guys just standing in a field, just shooting at each other. And so right now you're going to need whatever your attack system will be and whatever your defense system will be. And then you also need to know if you're going to have an armor or save value also incorporated into the way that your attacking works. So if you just want to do, I'm going to roll a dice, whatever the value is, compare it to the opponent's defense. Did I hit? Yay. If not, whatever. And then, go from there. And then you're also going to need some sort of, I would recommend a basic health system setup. So maybe it's just a health pool. If you're doing something more complicated, maybe not totally complicated, but like Revelation Skirmish has, or War Machine or Battletech, where you've got, for like your more mech or your larger units have location hit points. I would probably avoid those unless your game is primarily focused on mechs or big units, because those are going to just need more tweaking at first, versus if you just take some grunt units, some basic infantry, or whatever the common force is in your army or your universe, and have those square off against each other first. The other thing that I would do is I would make sure to use identical units in the beginning. So let's say you're going to come up with some basic grunt soldier. I would have basic grunt soldier fight basic grunt soldier. Don't do basic grunt soldier versus alien grunt soldier. Why? The reason being, right now, we're not testing stats. We're not testing differences in factions or faction abilities. Right now, we're testing fundamental mechanisms of how your game works. So if you don't hone in on your attack and defense system, and save if you have it, or armor, whatever you may title it, if you get too much into, I want to get into testing the variations in the different factions, well, you haven't tested the core mechanics yet. So you don't know if your system works. The other thing is, one faction may end up being very powerful compared to the other, so it won't even be balanced out of the gate. So it may skew the feelings you have about your game, because you're like, man, this is just not working. It's way unbalanced. It's not, one side just dominates every game that we do. But if you do a cloned list against another identical list, right, then you can control that, and you can kind of isolate the problems you have. All right. My recommendation at this point, and actually probably even from the beginning, I just maybe forgot to mention it, is that I think you should spend some time looking at your favorite miniature games. How did they design their stat system? What would you want to do differently? For those who don't have a pretty good idea of the scope and scale of their game, you really should spend some time looking at other games you love to play. What is the reason you wanted to make your game? Was it because you wanted to do a large scale conflict, or did you want to do a small team skirmish game? That changes the way that your initial mechanics need to be. That changes the way that a lot of the stuff that you're designing will need to be. And you could get lost in all that, but right now, just look at some of the other games, figure out the game that's probably closest to the type you're designing. Like if you're a huge fan of Warhammer 40K, but you're trying to design the next Guild Ball, well, those don't go together, right? You need to find another game that's similar to like Guild Ball, so that way it feels, pretty similar. And then you can sort of have somebody to kind of look at and say, okay, how'd they do their movement system? Okay, I hate that. I want to do something totally different. Or about their attack system or their defense system or their special abilities, other things that we're going to get into later. But like you can look at it and sort of analyze it and say, man, I really like 30% of this game, or I can't stand 25% of this game or whatever it is. And I would also recommend, I'm not going to advocate for copying straight out what another game does, but if I were you, I know some of you out there are probably going to be like, well, I love my favorite game, but I don't want to copy it too much or even give the appearance of copying it too much, because then, then people will think that I just stole that from that game. I wouldn't super worry about that myself. Not because, like I said, I'm not advocating for straight copying of somebody else's work by any stretch. As a creator that designs a lot of things, I don't want anybody just straight up stealing my work in any way. But I also understand that Revelation Skirmish, that Field of Legends, that all the game engines that I tried to work on in the past that I ended up abandoning, those were spawned off of somebody else's design, and then I tweaked it to the way I always wanted that other system to be. Or I combined mechanics from different games and I improved them, or I altered them the way that they would work together. So I would design my own system. You don't always have to reinvent the wheel in order to have a new wheel. You can just make some modifications to it and make some changes. I would try not to use the exact same vernacular. Whatever they title it, I would try to stay away from that, especially if yours is different, because you don't want people to necessarily associate it. But sometimes it gets difficult because later, somebody uses like morale, right? For example, just as a value. I don't even use that, but morale. How many other words can you use for a morale, right? It's kind of hard. You might be able to find one, but there's probably somebody out there who's also used that other word. So I only say that to point out, don't get too caught in your own heads and get paralyzed with indecision because you're like, Rick, I can't figure out how to be able to do it because anything I do will copy somebody else. That's okay. Right now, we're still beta testing. We're still doing the initial testing. Your mechanics could change 3, 4, 5, 6 times, right? You may not even end up with the same system, but you need something to start moving forward with, okay? Now, another thing that will matter a lot that you need to know kind of out of the gate, what sort of dice are you going to use? Are you going to use, so let's say you have an attack and then a counter save, right? So depending on how many hits will determine how many saves you roll. Are those going to be the same dice or are they going to be different? Are you going to use a D6 system, D10, D12, D8, whatever, D20? That all changes the sort of values that you can associate with your game. Because, for example, if you're using a D6 system, you can't have, unless you handle things correctly, you can't have the total defense of your enemies to be 25, right? How are you going to get to 25 rolling 1d6 plus an attack value, right? It's not going to happen unless your attack values are also really close. And then it's like, well, why are you using such high numbers if a d6 is going to make that much of a difference? Maybe that's how you want your system to be. That's up to you. But just saying, and are you going to use multiple dice when attacking? Are you going to do multiple dice to represent one attack? Or are you going to use multiple dice to represent multiple attacks? Are they going to be different colored dice? Are they going to have different unique symbols? That's totally up to you. And I didn't make this into a dice video or a podcast necessarily, but I probably should at least address this. If I were you, I would pick commonly available dice. By that, I mean dice that any player could get at any local game store or something off of Amazon. If your game system only will function if you have uniquely created dice, understand that is still doable, but now that's going to add a component of complexity for when you're actually going to manufacture and sell your game. You'll have to have custom dice made. So, for example, Star Wars Legion. Star Wars Legion uses D6s and D8s in its system, but they have blank sides, they have critical hit sides, they have surge, and they have hit. So those dice had to be uniquely made for their game. I can't just go down to my game store and say, hey, can I get some of these non-Legion dice? No, I have to buy Legion dice in order to play Star Wars Legion. That also can be a negative when it gets to marketing stuff because people may not want to buy your custom-made dice because they're probably going to be sold at a premium, which you can say whether that's pro or con, but it's still going to be a factor into it. So if you're making some sort of game engine, just keep in mind players may be upset because you use either unique measurement tools or dice. They may not, and that matter, and that comes down to whether or not you think that's worth it, whether you care, right? I designed Revelation Skirmish and also now Field of Legends to use a D10, D6 system. Well, why in the world would you do that? I like that a D10 has 1 through 10. I like that it has more variety in numbers so that when I'm doing my attacking and my defense totals, I can have more variety than if I only did a D6 system. I like having the D6 system for my saves because it just helps kind of make it a little bit simpler. So I've gone a little bit more complex on one part and then I've gone a little bit simpler on another, but I didn't want it to be a totally D6 system. And I didn't necessarily want it to be a totally D10 system because then I felt that the save system was a little overcomplicated. That was just my personal decision that I wanted to make. A lot of games use the same dice, right? They'll use, like Warhammer 40K uses all D6s, and that's fine. And maybe one day they'll change that. And it won't necessarily matter because a lot of people will buy it anyway. But for the time being, there's been a lot of other games. Let's see, the old Star Wars miniatures game from Wizards of the Coast used to use a D20 system. All kinds of different games. Mech Warrior Dark Age and from WizKids, and they also had HeroClix and other games. They all used D6, but they would use multiple D6 when performing an attack. So it kind of just depends on however you want to design it. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just kind of how complicated you want it to be. Personally, I don't like having to roll multiple different colored dice. So let's say I'm going to do something where I have to roll a whole bunch of different weapons. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to use my red dice is this, my blue dice is this, my green dice is this, my orange dice is this. Well, why? Because it's not uniform across the whole game. A lot of times when you run into that, it's because players have made that decision to use these different colored dice. So for me, I don't want to worry about colored dice. I don't want to worry about unique symbols for cost purposes. I want to just be able to do generic dice, D10, D6. Maybe you want to do D8s, D12s. Doesn't really matter. It's kind of just totally up to what you want your system to be. I would say that keep in mind that the more layers of complexity that you add when you're selling your starter kit or whatever the initial box set is for your game, it would be my strong recommendation that you do include dice. So just remember that the more different types of dice you put in there, that's more different types of dice you need to buy to fund and to supply your game. Yes, some people will just love their neon pink D6s out there, and that's perfectly fine. But as far as I don't know which player is going to get my starter kit that doesn't have dice. So I have to supply it because they purchased the game, and I have to assume that this may be the very first miniature game they've ever played, and they don't have even a measuring tape in their home. So I want to make sure I include all of those basic components that they need so that out of the box that I supply them, they can play my game. Okay, so just keep that in mind as you're designing your attack and defense system. Think about what D6 or D10 or whatever dice system you want to use so that you can perform attacks and then saves and armor if you use those components. So beyond that, my recommendations when testing, like I said before, use the same unit against each other. So have generic soldier 1 fighting generic soldier 1. Don't try to mix factions or different types of units at first. What we are testing is basic mechanics, not so much on stats. Okay, as you progress, you can add a lot more diversity, but focus on control first. All right. So just as a little side note, when I first designed Revelation Skirmish, I focused a lot of my time on the Core Republic. Well, why did I do that? Because I knew that in the Core Republic, that first off, that faction was meant to be more of a middle of the road faction. They weren't going to really specialize in anything, but they were going to have solid stats for basically everything. So for example, the basic Marine, the Core Republic Marine, was the infantry unit that all other units of infantry would be based off of. The Mars main battle tank, that was the main tank that all other vehicles would be based off of. The Sierra War Mech, again, it was the War Mech that all others would be based off of. So I knew that those 3 units, which represented all 3 types of units available in my game, were going to be the base model for all others. So I was able to have a lot of diversity when building some lists. Obviously not a lot of diversity, but enough that I could feel the different infantry, vehicle, and mech components and how they functioned against each other. But I was able to really get those stats locked in. And believe it or not, that takes a long time, because as you add more complex components, or you add new weapons, or you modify how much damage a weapon does, or how much the rate of fire is if you use that system in your game, all kinds of things, new keywords, all these can dramatically change the impact of how your game is played. So you want to try to figure out the base units first so that you can lock those in. And, you may still have to make changes, but at least you're getting closer to having control, so you know what maybe made a difference when you made a tweak, rather than I made 20 tweaks and I don't really know which one ended up being the thing that changed it. Okay. I would also recommend give yourself permission to fail and try again. Beating yourself up because the first game went terrible isn't going to help anyone. Not at all. When I look back on my very, 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 very initial Revelations rules type, which was even before Skirmish. It was when I was trying to do a larger scale game. It was the whole game was larger. The table space was larger. When I was going back to those very early days, that system to what I have now with Revelation Skirmish is night and day. Yeah, there was a couple of components that moved over, but man, the game is totally different, and it's streamlined. It works. It's so much fun to play. But compared to those old days, like, it's just totally different. And if I got upset with myself and I said, man, I suck at this because I keep making these changes and then things alter and I have to make more changes, that's part of this process. All right. I would also say, realize that part of designing a game, especially these early tests, are not going to always be fun, and they require patience. Because you have to make so many tweaks, I would recommend, because you're also playing maybe like if you're using squads, a generic squad versus a generic squad, and they're fighting each other, you can probably bang out 5 games really fast because they're just one unit against one unit. And that's still a full test session. And then you can make a minor tweak. Well, what if the critical hit system did this instead? Or what if, the weapon did 1 point less damage, or, whatever else. And then you can start adding in, movement modifiers if you have those, or terrain modifiers, but you want to try to control it so you're not doing it too much. And I feel like I beat that to death, but, this has been one of the harder parts for me sometimes, is designing and testing and trying to figure out what worked. And I don't know how easy that will be for everyone else. Because I'm more of an analytical person that can kind of see where there's problems pretty quickly. But sometimes I jump the gun and I'm ahead of myself. But I want to make sure you guys are prepared. That's all. Another thing is to analyze other games for inspiration. Like I said before, figure out the game that's probably closest to yours that you've experienced, preferably one that you've played maybe pretty extensively, because you have a little bit better understanding of the rules and the way that different things work together. If you just look and you ask some people, you're like, what game's close to this game that I'm designing? And they're like, yeah, some special game you've never heard of. Well, that doesn't really help you unless you're planning to go invest and get into that game and play it, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend, because, you may not want to drop $300 to $500 into a new game so that you can kind of fully grasp it. You may want to just keep that money for your development and your artwork, right? Another thing, don't come up with all of these super complex mechanics in the beginning. Write down your ideas, but don't try to flesh them all out. So keep a rough idea of how's my movement system going to work better, like when I run, or they jump, or they can fly. Maybe more complex things like keywords or special abilities or heroic abilities, whatever else you're going to add in. Keep those in your mind, write them down, but don't try to commit those to the game until you've done this initial level of testing. Okay, it'll just make things too complicated at the beginning. The other thing is, if you try to go through, and I know I've got some really analytical people, I'm sure, that are listening, that are like, Rick, I plan to write out basically most of the rules because I don't see any point in testing until I have a full game. Well, I will warn you that what will happen is, if you change certain mechanics, it could throw off a whole bunch of other things. So if you went through the trouble of mentally tiring yourself to go through the process of designing all these complex rules because you understand rules and you understand miniature games, you've been playing them for 30 years and you know what you're doing. Okay, but I'm telling you, there's a very big difference between reading rules and playing rules and designing rules. Those are all very different, okay? And I'm just telling you, as a creator, I don't like wasting time as much as I can. Sometimes it's difficult to avoid, but I try not to waste time. And if I know that I'm going to have to be doing extensive testing and that's going to change things, I'm already de-incentivized to even want to do it. So just keep that in mind. I wouldn't spend a lot of time writing your rule book when you haven't even thrown any dice at all. That's just my thing. I would also stress, do not worry about point values or really proper balance right now of weapons. When playing duplicate units, like I've mentioned before, you have less to worry about and you can control things as needed. If you get into, if I give them this weapon upgrade is going to be 10 points, or it's going to be 15, or it's going to be 100. I don't know, whatever your point system is. Or you're getting into the weeds. You're worrying about balance of points with stats when you don't even know if the stats are going to stay. So just do the controlled test first. All right? It'll make things a lot easier. Hopefully this episode has kind of helped lay some of the groundwork for you for your foundation. It's not something you can necessarily just say, focus on, these 5 values first and you'll be on your way to a finished game, because it kind of depends on the dice system you're using. Are you using an attack modifier, or are you just using straight dice value as your attack value? Are you using a defense, or are you just saying this is what it needs as a base to hit for all units? Is there going to be a save or an armor system that can kind of catch? So basically, in like Revelation Skirmish, we have a defense and then a save value. The defense is how hard it is to hit the target. So slow units, the defense will obviously be lower. Faster, more agile units, the defense is higher. But then the save value is how hard it is to damage said model. So if it's a really thick armored tank, it may be easy to hit, but it may not be easy to damage, right? Or, it moves really fast, but its save value is kind of garbage because it's got thin armor so that it can be really fast. But if you don't have those sort of mechanics, you can't necessarily look at Revelation Skirmish and say, okay, I'm going to emulate what Rick did and try to build my base from there. You need to kind of figure out what you want as your system. So again, to stress, I would recommend duplicate units, just standing out in the open, just shooting at each other. Because once you get the ranged attacks down, if your game is going to allow for strong ranged attacks, then you can go from there. Because it changes it. If you're a melee-based game and there might be some archers or some crossbowmen or something like that, you're like, it's mostly a melee game. It might be worth testing the melee first, but you need to be really careful later as you're testing that the ranged attacks don't become broken. Because my concern in that sort of situation would be that ranged attacks end up breaking the game if they're too easy to get hold of. And maybe that's not a concern for you, but that's just the way that my thinking works. All right, guys, thank you very much for listening, for all the support that we've been getting and trying to grow this podcast. We're getting views and listens and everything. So I guess it wouldn't be views because it's not a video. Anyway, talk to you guys again later. Have a great week. See ya.